Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The War on Alcohol, Prohibition, and the Rise of the American State by Lisa McGirr, narrated by Donna Postel. Preface. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office on March 4, 1933, with the global economy on the brink of collapse, he called Congress into special session. The new president inaugurated the New Deal's activist 100 days by urging quick passage of the Emergency Banking Act to rescue the financial system and the Economy Act to cut salaries of government employees and veterans' benefits. On his 8th day in office, Roosevelt forwarded his third major policy initiative after proclaiming to a small group of advisers, "It's time the country did something about beer." That very night, he drafted his plea to Congress for its legalization, declaring action at this time to be of the highest importance. When the clerk read Roosevelt's statement on the floor of Congress, cheers rang out. Less than 30 hours later, the beer bill sailed through the House. The commodity banned for close to 14 years was re-legalized on April 6th. At the nadir of the nation's economic catastrophe, beer took its place in the vanguard of New Deal measures. That night, a festooned truck, escorted by a police detail, pulled up to the White House, delivering 2 crates of the city's new brew. "President Roosevelt, the first real beer is yours," announced a large banner. Crowds braved the rain and the midnight hour to cheer at the White House gates. The years of national alcohol prohibition were laid to rest. 8 months later, the 21st Amendment rescinded the 18th Amendment, bringing to an end the boldest effort to remake private behavior in the nation's history. Around the country, the celebratory mood that welcomed the end of the war on alcohol was chastened by the daunting task of recovery and the massive crisis of unemployment. In the following 2 years, Roosevelt and Congress unleashed the largest burst of policy innovation the federal government has ever seen. The once preoccupying war on alcohol came to appear as but a footnote to the main drama of the New Deal and the regulatory state it spawned. Roosevelt's popular beer bill is ignored in most historical accounts of the New Deal's opening days. So too are the contributions of the war on alcohol to the development of the American state and to politics in 20th century America. On one level, this is not surprising. The 18th Amendment was, after all, one of the nation's most significant policy debacles. After less than 15 years, it became the first, and it remains the only, constitutional amendment to be rescinded. The admission by one former anti-liquor crusader that prohibition was stupidly wrong and had led to an utter disregard for law epitomized a widely accepted verdict by the time of repeal. Such a devastating pratfall, however, distracted contemporaries and later chroniclers from the significant but largely unacknowledged mark left on America's still developing state by this social experiment. This book restores national prohibition to its critical role in the building of the modern American state. For the most part, Great Depression contemporaries let prohibition simply drop from public consciousness. A few, however, did plumb its failure for deeper lessons. In 1934, the radical artist Ben Shahn, while employed by the Public Works of Art Project, an early New Deal initiative, painted 8 works on national prohibition for a mural project to be displayed in New York's Central Park. Each painting rendered a different dimension of the noble experiment, from federal enforcement, illicit bootlegging, and gangland killings to the religious reformers at the core of the campaign. When officials rejected Shahn's sketches, they provided no reason for their decision. Perhaps they considered the witty, biting commentary on the recently failed government effort backward-looking compared to the muscular optimism of mainstream New Deal art. Federal arts workers, including Shahn himself in his larger body of work, honed in on the dignity of the common man and championed a more heroic vision of the government as his supporter and friend. Sean's series on the government's great disciplinary experiment held different, potent lessons on the self-aggrandizing dynamics of the penal state and anti-narcotics activity. The generation of historians writing soon after the New Deal and World War II did not entirely ignore Prohibition, but they overwhelmingly emphasized its failings. The majority shared liberal New Deal reform sensibilities, and they drew a sharp separation between the New Deal and the war on alcohol that preceded it. They found the origins of the New Deal coalition not in debates between wets and dries, but in the material dislocations of the Great Depression. They linked New Deal policymakers to earlier economic regulatory efforts, from the income tax to the Federal Trade Commission, not to the institutional rigors of running a massive expansion of the federal enforcement establishment. The influential historian Richard Hofstadter wrote in a post-World War II dismissal that became gospel that the 18th Amendment was a farce, a vestigial remnant of the World War I reform debauch and its crusading village cast of mind. He relegated it to a symbol of the moral overstrain of the preceding era, the butt of jokes, a perennial source of irritation, a memento of the strange power of crusades of absolute morality to intensify the evils they hoped to destroy. Such preposterous restrictions were, Hofstadter implied, completely ineffectual. Historians writing after Hofstadter mostly followed this viewpoint, concluding, as one account did, there was never any serious effort to enforce national prohibition until the early 30s, and by that time it was too late. A later generation of historians broke with Hofstadter's dismissal of the progressive reform impulse behind the 18th Amendment, but they continued to marginalize it in other ways. Convinced that the amendment was essentially dead on arrival, most scholars have focused on the struggle to pass such an impractical project, neglecting as predetermined its flawed implementation and eventual failure. Some scholars even interpreted Prohibition as a symbolic crusade, whose real aim was to affirm the cultural dominance of Yankee Protestantism. Even those few historians who focused on the Prohibition years devoted most of their attention to the repeal effort among influential elites, or the farcical attempts to enforce Prohibition in wet jurisdictions. Filling the vacuum, there developed an entire genre of sensationalist books and movies set in the Prohibition years. They featured a colorful cast of bootleggers and gangsters, from Chicago's Al Capone to Ohio's George Remus. In these narratives, bootleg liquor flows freely, cultural rebellion flowers in the back rooms of speakeasies, and criminal entrepreneurs make and lose fabulous fortunes, and sometimes their lives. These fragmentary portraits of the Prohibition years have had an outsized impact on both popular and scholarly understandings of the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age. Taken together, they have obscured one of America's greatest experiments in state building and its lasting institutional and ideological effects. The selective focus of these chronicles on elite groups and the national level, moreover, buries the highly differential impact of the law on distinct social groups, many of whom face parallel challenges to this day. This book tells a more consequential story, one closely attuned to the ways in which social class, ethnicity, race, gender, and religiosity powerfully shaped not just the passage of the 18th Amendment, but also its more than decade-long unfolding across the nation. The war on alcohol charts the battles waged over Prohibition between different social groups, from its unfolding to its demise. The seemingly uniform impact of the national law actually took on a very different cast in distinct settings, from metropoles like Chicago and New York to small towns and cities such as Herrin, Illinois, and Richmond, Virginia. In these varied settings, the Prohibition drama features a new cast of characters: policy entrepreneurs and religious reformers, local and state enforcement agents, immigrant workers, ethnic politicians, and struggling rural whites and African Americans. Through these ordinary Americans, we see the effects of Prohibition on everyday experience. This approach also recasts our understanding of broader historical developments, including the political awakening of the religious right, the electoral realignment that launched the New Deal, and the emergence of the 20th century federal penal state. As the story unfolds, it will become clear that the war on alcohol was no mere distraction with few lasting consequences. Prohibition remade national party politics and imprinted the path of American state development into distinctive and permanent molds. The war on alcohol was a prime example of a recurring theme of United States mass politics. The nation's powerful traditions of evangelical Protestantism and its freewheeling brand of expansive capitalism emerged in tandem and in tension with one another. This combination of forces periodically fueled moral crusades among men and women unsettled by social conflict and change. These reformers turned to the state to stabilize the social order and secure their place within it, with strong doses of coercive moral absolutes. Their monumental anxieties over industrial capitalism, mass immigration, and the increasingly large and potentially volatile proletarian populations congealed around the campaign against the saloon and the liquor traffic. The nation's first narcotics war focused these myriad grievances on the liquor trade and the social ills it purportedly engendered. Imbued with resonant themes of Protestant evangelicalism, the 100-year-old temperance movement found its white knight in the growing power of the nation-state during the Progressive Era and World War I. Anti-liquor crusaders turned toward the radical solution of a national ban by the federal government in the early 20th century and rode a wave of institution building, regulatory reforms, and constitutional activism to power. Without the potent elixir of moral panic from the Prohibition Army, progressive reformers might have adopted significantly more moderate and gradualist forms of liquor control as a cure for the saloon problem. But many urban progressives, scientific experts, social workers, and settlement house workers, including luminaries such as Jane Addams, instead embraced the momentum and vigor of the Crusaders' more absolutist approach. After the outbreak of World War I in Europe, the clamor for efficiency, ending waste, and war preparedness made the radical reform unstoppable. Its parentage of moral crusaders and efficiency-minded progressive reformers built their successful coalition in a united fight against public working-class drink in the saloon. That early logic set the stage for the type of enforcement that followed. The enforcement of Prohibition was notable for its magnitude and its selectivity. Not surprisingly, for a movement led at its core by the well-heeled Protestant Anti-Saloon League, enforcement hit working-class, urban immigrant, and poor communities hardest. It was, after all, enacted to discipline their leisure in the first place. The war on alcohol charts the repercussions of selective enforcement in two distinct geographical regions. It first examines the reshaped landscape of drink in Chicago, among the city's heavily ethnic working-class population. Here we see how and why the enforcement of Prohibition proved a powerful grievance for men and women already hostile to the law itself. The closure of saloons, the violence of organized crime, costly and sometimes poisoned bootleg liquor, and the law's identification as an attack on immigrant culture provided these men and women a stronger shared identity across their distinctive groups. The sporadic early opposition took on a more consequential cast when ethnic political brokers leveraged the cause of Prohibition opposition to awaken in their voting base a new national political consciousness. Selective enforcement had different, but just as significant repercussions for poor communities elsewhere. Exploring the thicket of enforcement in Virginia, the war on alcohol reveals the harsh and frequently deadly realities of enforcement for poor men and women in socially and racially stratified communities in the South. Southern law enforcement officials, like authorities elsewhere, used prohibition to police communities already identified as prone to criminality. The vast market that supplied illegal liquor was tawdry, corrupt, and violent, its operations smoothed by the frequently porous boundaries between enforcement officials and suppliers. At the same time, Prohibition law enforcement was anything but a dead letter. In the poor communities that bore its brunt, it contributed to a crisis of overcrowded court dockets and prisons. By one gross measure, the popular image of Prohibition is correct. The partial enforcement of Prohibition did little to stem the oceans of liquor supplied by the black market to thirsty Americans. In many places, men and women flagrantly violated the law. Among them, a small, affluent group of self-proclaimed avant-garde challenged the constricting norms they associated with Prohibition in a new world of vibrant, experimental, and permissive leisure. The war on alcohol charts the nightlife revolution at its epicenter, New York, and the cultural earthquake that radiated outward to smaller towns and cities through the new media of mass culture. Much to the dismay of its advocates, Prohibition, as we will hear, proved a cultural accelerant to the more permissive norms of a newly emergent corporate middle class. Faced with flagrant violations, permissive sexual norms, and interracial mixing, hallmarks of the experimental world of nightlife leisure, Prohibition's foot soldiers did not signal retreat. Instead, they counterattacked under a new banner of law and order. Already anxious over Catholicism, immigration, religious modernism, labor strife, shifting gender norms, and African American militancy in the aftermath of World War I, a multi-pronged army of citizen enforcers launched the first incarnation of the 20th century religious right. These citizen enforcers, including the large temperance organizations and the Ku Klux Klan, utilized the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act, the law passed to enforce Prohibition, and its state equivalents, to wage a broad assault on the enemies of white Protestant nationalism. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, in fact, enabled the Klan's rise to power. In southern Illinois, we see an example of how the Klan won droves of recruits battling bootlegging and lawlessness, using violence and intimidation to wage war against threats to 100% Americanism. This example was mirrored elsewhere on smaller scales. Klan vigilantism, in turn, provoked controversy and counter-mobilization, even among former allies in the war on alcohol. The Klan's meteoric growth then ended in equally rapid decline. Faced with the unintended consequences of Prohibition, many men and women began to rethink their commitments to the war on alcohol, but they did not altogether reject the state's right to police and punish the use of other recreational narcotics. The rise and power of the Klan was only the most egregious of the many affronts that Prohibition posed to urban immigrant and heavily Catholic working-class men and women. These grievances sharpened their politicization, forging them into a potent political bloc. When a candidate from the sidewalks of New York, Al Smith, hoisted the banner of Prohibition repeal in 1928, they coalesced around the National Democratic Party as never before. By charting the grassroots political mobilization of these men and women in urban industrial communities, from Chicago to Pittsburgh, we will find out that opposition to the war on alcohol laid the foundation for the ethnic urban working-class base that Franklin D. Roosevelt rode to the White House. Lawlessness, corruption, violence, and cultural rebellion eroded support for Prohibition, and the Great Depression sealed its fate. Alcohol re-emerged by 1933, with a diminished, but no longer seriously contested, place in American recreational culture. Repeal struck the law from the books, but its effects on the nation-state proved indelible. Scholars of 20th century American political development have long mapped the sources and tributaries of the young nation's social welfare state. Typically, they move from the enactment of pensions for Civil War veterans and mothers to Progressive-era regulatory reforms, and finally the New Deal years, leapfrogging over the 1920s, the decade of national prohibition, as a period of retrenchment and laissez-faire. In doing so, they miss the contribution of the war on alcohol to the character of the 20th century American state, a state that has been interventionist yet weak, heavy on coercion yet light on social welfare. Prohibition, and the wave of crime and violence it unleashed, forged the foundations of a less examined side of 20th century state building, the federal penal state. Even with its vast corruption, inefficacy, and insufficient funding, Prohibition marked the birth of a qualitatively new and enduring role of the federal state in crime control. The massive, flagrant violations of the law in response to the war on alcohol engendered a new public panic over crime. For the first time, crime became a national problem and a national obsession. The effort to restore law and order resulted in streamlined federal criminal record-keeping, professionalized prison administration, new prison growth, and expanded and muscular federal policing, including stronger authority and a broadened purview for the FBI. Herbert Hoover, whose lifetime of vigorous state-building was hidden behind a reputation as an American individualist, bolstered the federal penal state. Hoover's approach to the wars on alcohol, crime, and narcotics was consistent with this Quaker engineer's neoliberal sensibility, a political philosophy that would return once more with vigor to Washington in the latter third of the 20th century. Hoover favored the use of expansive state power, but for conservative purposes. Just as early New Deal economic initiatives built on Hoover's ideas, so too did Roosevelt embrace and extend Hoover's war on crime. Indeed, far less ambivalent about expansive federal powers, the Roosevelt administration pushed them to another level, bolstering the power and visibility of J. Edgar Hoover's fledgling FBI. Long overlooked, these continuities between the New Deal and the Hoover administration comprise some of the most durable achievements of both administrations. Despite its baleful enforcement, Prohibition and the escalating crime it sparked permanently convinced Americans to look to the federal government for solutions to new national problems. The government did not retreat from its new role in crime control after the end of the war on alcohol. Its punitive approach to recreational narcotics persisted and expanded in new directions, building on the lessons learned from federal alcohol prohibition. The nation's nascent domestic and international drug prohibition regime emerged symbiotically with national alcohol prohibition. It drew upon the logic, the core moral entrepreneurs, and the beachheads of bureaucratic influence won during the anti-alcohol campaign. As broad support for the war on alcohol waned and then collapsed, key anti-liquor crusaders turned their energies toward the less controversial war against recreational narcotic drugs. With a second 20th century drug war contributing to a new crisis of overcrowded prisons and uncounted social costs, there is no better time to revisit the history of national alcohol prohibition. 1. The making of a radical reform. On December 11, 1913, anti-liquor crusaders from every state of the Union gathered in downtown Washington. The nation's powerful temperance organizations had united in a great joint committee to demand federal action to outlaw the nation's liquor traffic. Organized in 2 phalanxes, they marched to the Capitol in military style. Brigadier General Aaron S. Daggett, a veteran of both the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, headed up the Anti-Saloon League Committee of 1,000. A young boy bearing an American flag and flanked by 50 girls in prim white dresses led the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The president of the Anti-Saloon League rallied the marchers when they arrived at the seat of Congress and championed their radical purpose. "The time has come," he blazed, "for the federal government to banish the worst enemy of civilization, alcohol, from shore to shore." Georgia's WCTU temperance cyclone, Mary Harris Armour, addressed the Crusaders as well. Praising the new call for a constitutional amendment to end the liquor traffic, she boldly predicted that national prohibition would be the law of the land by 1920. Alabama Congressman Richmond P. Hobson greeted the men, women, and children gathered on the Capitol steps on that brisk December day. With a military bearing, and so strikingly handsome that he had earned a reputation as a Victorian Don Juan as a young man, America's most kissed man ever, according to one biographer, Hobson lauded the Crusaders for their loftiest motives of patriotism in the service of our country and the interests of humanity. Hobson, an ardent prohibitionist, had authored a resolution in favor of a constitutional ban on liquor that he planned to introduce to Congress. He exhorted the Prohibition Army to press on in the war on the liquor traffic. For, as he claimed in one of his many addresses, "The principles of war are the same whether it is a war between nations or a war between civilization and its destroying foe, the liquor traffic." This was no mere rhetorical flourish. Hobson's military experience molded his approach toward the nation's war on alcohol. A steadfast champion of United States naval power and imperial ambitions in Asia, Admiral Hobson had served during the Spanish-American War in 1898. He returned home a war hero for his part in a risky but ill-fated mission to scuttle the U.S. collier Merrimac to blockade Cuba's Santiago harbor. The jingoist press transformed the failed venture into the stuff of myth, a celebration of American daring and ingenuity, and Hobson became a wartime celebrity. He later served in the Philippines, where the opium trade flourished. The effort to suppress this commerce became one means by which the United States sought to exert new muscle in the region. The United States banned opium from its new possession in 1905. Hobson emerged from these experiences a strong advocate of national power, imperial expansion, and international, as well as domestic, narcotics control. The former naval commander turned politician identified intoxicating liquor, too, in line with contemporary scientific temperance knowledge, as a narcotic, a life destroyer, toxic to mind and soul. After a career in military service, he instinctively sought to bring federal power to bear on this domestic traffic, just as United States diplomats, missionaries, and military commanders were beginning to do in the global drug trade. The resolution he introduced to Congress for the 18th Amendment declared, in no uncertain terms, "Alcohol is a narcotic poison, destructive and degenerating to the human organism, that lowers, to an appalling degree, the average standard of our citizenship, threatening the very life of the nation." Richmond Hobson exemplified a new component, and arguably the critical ingredient of the decades-old prohibition effort, a distinctly modern fusion of 20th-century nation-state building with an older strand of Protestant moral righteousness. The increased exertion of national power, Hobson believed, required a strong and efficient citizenry. This new logic, with its secular twist, widened alcohol prohibition's resonance and linked it to new cross-border, state and national, narcotic drug control efforts. For half a century, prohibition sentiment had drawn strength from powerful currents in evangelical circles, that viewed intoxicating liquor as a moral evil. Hobson, who grew up in the Cotton Empire.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?